In today's video, I'm going to show you a Prismatic Warlock build that will make you borderline unkillable in high level content, all while providing insane ability regen and damage output. This has by far been one of my favorite builds I've made due to the overall survivability and ability to take on even the most powerful enemies head on. So I'll cover the aspects, fragments, exotic, weapons, and mods you'll need to get the most out of this Prismatic Warlock build. Diving into our build, and we are going to be starting with Storm Trance. And again, this is less about the super and more about the overall survivability Storm Trance will help us bring to this build, but we'll talk about that more later. Jumping into our class ability, we're going to be using the tried and true Phoenix Dive. We use this mainly for one, the healing of course, but the frequency of which we can use it because of the lower cooldown compared to something like Healing Rift, which is also very good, but Phoenix Dive is going to allow us to pop our class ability as much as possible. Next, we're going to be using Arcane Needle. This is going to allow us to do that unraveling damage to our enemies, and it's going to help with our overall damage output by spreading that unraveling to other targets. It helps with a lot of add damage as well. Next, we're going to be running Healing Grenade, and this is going to pair into our exotic, which is almost impossible to hide as I'm showing you this, but we'll talk more about that later. But Healing Grenade is going to be the grenade you're going to want to use for this build. And that's going to tie into our exotic of choice. And then of course, as I've talked about, Feed the Void per always to give us that additional healing and grenade regeneration. Just a really free and easy way to get huge benefits overall. And then we're going to be running Hellion. I think it's Hellion. I got some feedback. I believe it's Hellion. And this is going to allow us to do that additional scorch damage, just light damage overall. And we're going to get this a lot because we're running Phoenix Dive, and the ability to use our class ability frequently is going to allow us to have Hellion as much as possible. For our fragments, we're starting with Facet of Purpose, where picking up Aura Power grants either Amplified, Restoration, Frost Armor, Woven Mail, or Overshield based on our super, and that ties in exactly with Storm Trance, and it's going to allow us to get Amplified, which is going to later tie into one of our artifact mods, which is going to help a lot with our damage resistance on this build, because a big feature of this build is really the survivability. Next, we're running Facet of Hope. We have an elemental buff. Your class ability regenerates more quickly, and with this build, you're basically going to have an elemental buff or multiple elemental buffs going all at the same time, and so you're going to get your class ability back really quickly while running this build. Next, we're running Facet of Balance. Rapidly defeating targets with light damage grants melee energy. Rapidly defeating targets with darkness damage grants grenade energy, and we're going to be doing a lot of darkness damage, so it's giving us just another way to get our grenade back, our healing grenade back, as quickly as possible. And I've tried running the same build not using this fragment, and it just doesn't seem as potent. I wasn't getting my grenade as often as I really wanted to, and so I really want to stress the importance of running this specific fragment. Next, we're running Facet of Dawn. Power melee hits against targets makes you radiant. So this will allow us to be radiant, do some additional damage, which can just really help with our damage output overall, especially on things like subjugators. And this ties in nicely with Facet of Hope because, again, radiant is considered a power elemental buff, and so that is these two tie in directly to each other to help with that overall class ability cooldown and damage output simultaneously. And then lastly, Facet of Protection. So while surrounded by combatants, you are more resistant to incoming damage, and this build is a little bit more close up and personal, I would say, for the most part. So this is going to be procced a lot just to give us another layer of damage resistance as we're out there fighting enemies. Getting into our exotic, none other than Speaker's Sight, and Healing Grenades spawn a restorative turret. So this turret will give us restoration, so it's going to help us just regenerate our health very quickly. And the nice thing about this is it kind of has like two effects. When you're standing really close to the turret, it's going to keep creating like this AoE effect where it's like doing a burst of healing, and then when you're further away, it's going to shoot out a little orb that's going to track over to you and help you heal as well. So you don't always have to be close to it, but I personally found it most effective when you kind of play within a really close radius of the turret, and so that'll really just help with your overall healing. And so that's what makes this build really crank up the survivability, because even with the Devour, sometimes in this minus 20 minus 25 content, you can still get caught slipping, right? If you don't proc Devour, you can die. And so having the Lost Voice with the Speaker's Sight, procking and throwing your healing grenades as much as possible is really going to be the name of the game. And so having this exotic really just takes your survivability just to insane levels. You're constantly healing, just tanking tons of damage, whether you're getting your health in large chunks back from Devour or getting that restoration over time from Speaker's Sight. It's just non-stop. And when you get things really rolling, you're able to throw multiple of these healing turrets at once, which is really great. And keep in mind, this is all considered an elemental buff, you getting healed by this grenade. This allows us to get our class ability back very quickly, which can allow us to do our Phoenix dive more often, and thus getting our Hellion ability activated more frequently as well. And then we have, with all this survivability, all this damage we're going to be tanking, we have to pair it with something that's going to deal a ton of damage and make it worth it. And that's what brought me to Final Warning. And I even was able to get the Catalyst. And so with Final Warning, this is where all at once holding down the trigger marks targets within range, loading multiple bullets which fire in a burst with increased stability on trigger release. Hitting a marked target with a full charged burst will unravel them. So this gives us another way outside of Arcane Needle, get that unraveling going. And then of course with Pick Your Poison, aiming projectiles have greatly increased velocity and deal extra critical damage. And then we add a Catalyst, which I don't even know how this thing has a Catalyst because it's already so strong. Hits against marked targets deal increased damage and have a chance to refund ammo to the magazine. And so this makes Final Warning just all that more powerful, and especially more powerful for this build. For those wondering about the Catalyst, you do get this from, I believe it's Vanguard, Crucible, or Gambit activities. Shout out to my Gambit mains. And so I do recommend getting the Catalyst, but even if you don't have the Catalyst, this build, this weapon is still gonna go great with this build. And then for everything else, I literally in this footage and this build, I used nothing else. That is truly how strong Final Warning combined with this build really is. I didn't even really use my Super or Prismatic all that often because I really didn't need to. But in a pinch, you could prop Prismatic to really take this whole thing to another level. But in terms of what you run here, in terms of your energy slot and your heavy slot, you can run whatever you like. For our artifact mod, there's a couple of here. You want to use Elemental Siphon. So rapid final blows with kinetic weapon or weapon matching your equipped super. Great elemental pickup. Again, we're not going to be really utilizing this, but just nice to have. But the main ones you're going to want to be using are Threaded Blast. You're going to be creating a lot of tangles because we're getting kills with the strand weapon. And so this does a ton of damage. And it's a very large area of damage, pretty hard for enemies to avoid or for it to not do some kind of damage to something. Also, when you destroy a tangle, this also is an easy way to proc Devour. So when you get kills with tangles, it does proc Devour. So this makes this just 10 times more valuable in my opinion. Next, we're going to be running Radiant Orbs. So we have a Solar Prismatic subclass. Picking up an Orb of Power makes you Radiant. So now between our melee ability, getting hits with that, and picking up Orbs of Power, which also make us amplified, with this will also make us Radiant as well, just giving us even more damage output to stack on top of all the damage we're going to be doing with the Final Warning. And then Galvanic Armor is a huge one as well. We have an Arc Prismatic subclass equipped. Incoming damage from fans is reduced while amplified, and so this is great because this can just take our survivability to a whole nother level. I did try using this build without having to perk Galvanic Armor and using something like Woven Mail via like Broodweaver, and it was still really, really good. But this, with Galvanic Armor, this build truly makes you borderline unkillable. And then next, and certainly not least, is Shield Crust. And then while amplified or radiant, your grenade recharge faster, and that's the main reason we're getting this. So just another way to make sure we're getting our grenade back as much as possible. Obviously our grenade's not doing damage, but it's gonna allow us to make sure we're doing everything possible to get your grenade back as much as possible, so we can throw down that healing turret, get the restoration going, get our class ability back, hop Hellion, and continue to just dish out a ton of damage between Hellion and Final Warning, and then also just keeping our health constantly regenerating. So for our mods, you're gonna want to run 3 strand siphon mods. The reason we're going to do this allows us to get orbs, as many orbs of power as possible, as we're getting tons of kills with Final Warning. This allows us to make sure we're as amplified as often as possible, radiant as often as possible, and just make sure our overall damage output and damage resistance is always as high as it possibly can be while running around and getting healed by our turret. For our gloves, actually everything, since we have so much going on for grenade, I figured I would give some love to our melee ability. Running Focusing Strike grants class ability and energy when you cause damage to power melee attack. So this is actually specifically to help more with our class ability a little bit further. And then Font of Vigor, because we're picking up so many orbs, I like to use this just to get some a bonus to strength while we're using those armor charges up, so as to help with that strength regen overall. For our chest piece, just your typical damage resistance mods here for whatever activity you're running. And then for our armor, I'm running better already, so health begins to regenerate immediately upon picking up an orb of power. I found this is still pretty helpful just as you're running around to sometimes grab orbs, just to get that immediate health regen in a pinch if you need it. Running Invigoration reduces melee cooldown each time you pick up an orb of power, so again, something to help out our melee cooldown a little bit more. And then Absolution reduces all ability cooldown each time you pick up an orb of power, just to kind of even everything out as we with those orbs of power as well. And so I think this overall makes a really well-rounded build in terms of energy regen with these armor mods. Overall, I really enjoyed this build. It's probably been one of my favorite builds I've made to date in terms of the overall survivability and the ability of how much damage you can output. This may be a little bit biased as well because I just really love Final Warning, especially now that I have the Catalyst, but I thought it would just paired so well with the Speaker's Sight exotic armor, along with all the aspects, fragments, and mods we threw in together. And so I think this creates a really strong build where you can, there was times where I was challenging 1 or 2 subjugators at a time and just taking on a bunch of damage. But of course, in any content, you can't just stand there and take damage and do nothing. You do have to move a little bit, so I would keep that in mind. You're not gonna be able to just stand there and do nothing and take a bunch of damage. But as long as you're moving a little bit and you're throwing those turrets down, you're gonna be proccing Devour. You're gonna be amplified and radiant at the same time, triggering a bunch of damage resistance and damage output. And so this just makes this build tons of fun, and I'm excited to give this build a try going into the launch of the new episode starting tomorrow, which I guess technically when you see this video will be today. But let me know in the comments if you have Speaker Sight, what you think of it in the comments below, or any cool builds you have been using that utilize it.